I think it's that time. For what? Another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Welcome back. It's your host, Gautam Yegapin, alive and blessed to present you with today's conversation. Stay thirsty for knowledge, and I guess some water too. I don't normally drink coffee, but I have a wonderful cup of coffee with me today, and I'm feeling extremely awake and excited for today's conversation. We are speaking with Diana Rodríguez Gómez. She is the assistant professor in the Department of Educational Policy Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research investigates the intersection of educational policy, state formation, and conflict in regions affected by violence, particularly in Latin America. Drawing on ethnographic and qualitative research methods, she explores how governance, fragility, and state building are enacted through education systems, especially in contexts where public institutions are contested, incomplete, or in flux. I am really excited for today's conversation. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm thrilled to be here with you. And curious about where this conversation is going to take us.
Me too. I feel like that's one of my favorite things about this, where it's like, it really is fascinating how one idea leads to the next, to the next, to the next, and then you end up with this art project of some sort that you had no idea would form at the beginning. And I think that's how I feel like the best conversations often are.
I'm ready for you to poke me, okay? Just push me.
Okay, we can start. Our great starting point would be the earrings. What is the origin story behind those earrings? Because they're so cool.
Thank you for that. This one's come from Spain. My mother lives in southern Spain. She's Colombian too, but she lives in Spain. And I got them as a Christmas present.
Wow.
So
And
I wish there was a more interesting story, but that's what it is. A beautiful present from mother to daughter.
Oh, I mean, they look like moons, which is why it looks like a crescent.
Yeah.
Like, Yeah. Nice. Cool. I feel like it's always fascinating. Jewelry, there's a lot of things like cuisine, jewelry, where every culture has a very beautiful, unique relationship with it. And you can learn so much just if you just took one of those things, like, okay, I want to study jewelry across the world. You could learn so much about humans just by looking at that one medium, And I find that to be something that's really fascinating, no matter what you take.
I think that if we had to give meaning to my earrings today, it would be like a power object. Is like, okay, I'm a little nervous about the conversation, so let me just get my artifacts around so I can navigate it.
Yeah. I'm curious, because you brought that up, I wanted to hear what you thought, because I was having a conversation with a friend yesterday about just having these conversations with so many professors and academics from around the world. But I feel like younger professors have this extreme pressure, or just younger academics have this extreme pressure to they have this inner dialogue of okay, this gets recorded. I need to make sure everything I say is up to point, where when you talk to people who are much older, they kind of have this freedom of speech where they're my career is already mostly done. I can kind of say whatever I want. But I think the really scary thing is, one of the most beautiful things about academia is that whatever people do believe is very temporally contextualized. So it's true or real in that moment. But most often in 100 years, a lot of what people think or say is often proven wrong, or it was just part of the theory or idea. You never have to have the complete thing. And I think that's also the beauty of academia. Do you feel like the pressure to have to always say the right thing or the correct thing can actually sometimes take away from that beauty of being academia is beautiful because you can be wrong, as long as we move closer towards some sort of truth in the future? It's a process.
I think that academia is beautiful because it opens the space for us to think with others. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so unique. And that's why we need to fight to protect higher ed today. This is the only institution in our society that creates the space and the conditions for us to come together to explore ideas. And I love that. But at the same time, we cannot ignore the current political climate. So we know that we have been recorded, and we know that maybe some people are paying attention to what we're saying, and we don't have control over what people are going to do with the information that you put out there. So I think that's maybe one of the reasons you will find assistant professors being more hesitant or more doubtful about what to say. And I also think that there's something very liberating that comes with age. I mean, I'm only 43, but right now I feel much more freer than when I was, I don't know, 25. But I was like, okay, I know I'm going to upset some people, and that's fine. That's part of the process. But I can only imagine how it feels like when you're 65 or 70. It's like, give a shit about anything because you had already done everything that you wanted to do. And besides, it's also, as I told you at the beginning of our conversation, I'm not a native speaker. And sometimes I messed up. And I think that I have learned a lot from that. I love when I'm teaching with my undergrad and my graduate students. Sometimes I ask them, how do you say this thing? And some Spanish speaker in the room will give me the word, or students, when I don't know how to pronounce something correctly, they will help me. And I think that that has been very informative of how I think of my identity as a professor. There's a space of humility and vulnerability that I get through my non-nativeness. And I appreciate that. That's something that I didn't have when I was in Colombia. Maybe in Colombia I was an entitled, cocky, boring professor. And here I'm becoming a better human being. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think there's so much to what you're even saying there. And I feel like it'll be nice to I'm really excited to connect what we're talking about now, even to just education in different places, especially where there is a lot more fragility. Because one, you mentioned about how a lot of schools and education is a space to think and come together. But also, I feel like it's an amazing place to... I feel like there's no such thing as a mistake, really, in a space of a classroom, right? I mean, I think because mistakes often are the groundwork for what allows you to grow and change and to like move into a new place, right? And I think like I often find that to be really beautiful, where in spaces where you're not necessarily criticized or there's no real consequences to making mistakes, you actually can so much more freely do them. And then when someone is like, okay, well, you can also try doing it like this, you use that as a space to grow. And on the other hand, I feel like I grew up in some environments where perfection was always expected. So people would be so afraid to even try something because you can never be perfect day one at anything. It's just not possible. And so that expectation of like, no mistakes is just so unrealistic, because then you'll only do the few things that you once learned how to do well, and you'll continue to only do those. And I feel like that's why I think even with the show, I try to create a space where it's like there are no mistakes. Like a cat walks across your screen, that's part of the game. Like, someone forgets something and needs to start over. Like that's just such a normal part of being human that I think shows that can try to present like this perfect, what it's like to be perfect actually takes away from like the rawness of being human.
I agree with you that when it comes to coming together to understand something, we should have total freedom to mess up and start again and explore a thing from 1,000 different angles. But if we try to think about what I have learned from doing research in armed conflict settings, there are mistakes that are very costly. I mean, there are many things that cannot be said. There are many things that cannot be done because there will be very effective consequences. So I think I'm moving away from the concern with perfection and thinking about how we understand mistakes can only be done in relation to a context. And when I think about my students here at UW-Madison, they should be able to make all possible mistakes with me, right? And I should be able to support them and walk through the process with them. But there are other settings where armed actors won't allow you to do mistakes, even in a school setting. So, yeah.
I mean, so much of this, I think, is from my side, a limit of perspective, which is why I'm like super excited to get into today's conversation, because I feel like something that comes up again and again through these conversations is like you just said, a particular opinion often is crafted through the perspectives that you have access to, or the things that you yourself have experienced. And it's just becoming so clear to me the more I do this work of how limited my understanding of the world is, because there's just so many different existences that are so different from mine that I can't actually understand it until, at the very least, I create the space to hear truly without my own kind of lens. I'm like, what is your experience like? And so I think maybe one thing that we could start with is for listeners who may not be familiar with what countries or environments that are experiencing a lot of political fragility or violence, what that's like. I guess maybe a place to start is like, what would you say are some of the key differences and obviously each place is different, but just to try to put ourselves into the shoes of people who are growing up in environments where there is a lot more like fragility, I guess, in politically, whether it's a rapid change of governments, whether like what would you say are some of the characteristics that are different?
I mean, before we start the conversation, I want to clarify that, as you just said, that everything that I'm going to share comes from my experience as a researcher who's committed to ethnographic research. That doesn't mean that I can always do that. But that also means that I'm always very concerned about depth and not necessarily breadth. So if you ask me, Diana, what does it mean to be a student today in Yemen? I don't have the data to answer that. So I'm going to bring stories from my research in Eastern Colombia to answer that, and of course my experience as a professor when that becomes relevant. So I do think that you're completely right in understanding that those experiences are unique, and those are very different from what we experience when we lived in areas that are not impacted by armed violence. That's why I think it's so important for all education stakeholders to pay attention to and to support the specific needs of educators and students who are living in armed conflict settings. To be clear, we're not talking here about a few hundred students around the world. Right now, we're talking about millions of young people who are facing the direct effects of war. It's very sad because I remember when I started doing my doctorate back in 2011, when I said that I wanted to do work with refugees, education emergencies was already a field, but my interest in armed conflict felt like very niche, very specific. And right now, that's not the case. There's this organization that I really love. It's called the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data. It's called ECLID. And they have a conflict index. And for the last year, they recorded over 205,000 events, conflict events around the world. So this is not the global south. This is not about those poor people in Colombia or any other distant country. This is a global phenomenon. So with that in mind, I think that as general audience, we are more acquainted with the very physical effects of war, right? We hear about child recruitment, killings, sexual violence, attacks on schools, kidnappings, sometimes the denial of humanitarian access. But what is very hard for us is to imagine that students and teachers in these settings are trying teachers to work and students to learn. So that means that these kids, 7 a.m. in the morning, are getting their bags and they're trying to get to school to do the same thing that you used to do in California, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago. Here I'm playing with your age. And 30 years ago, in my case. So to show you the specificity of their experiences, I want to share a story with you. Gladys is a primary school teacher in Eastern Colombia with over 20 years of experience. And one day she arrived to the school wearing her helmet, because that's how she got to the hamlet, in her motorcycle. And the students told her, "Why are you encasquetada? Why are you wearing a helmet? Did you see that the guerrilla already put like posters across the hamlet advising that my goodness, helmets shouldn't be used?" And then she was so concerned about it. She was, in our conversation, she was telling me like, "Diana, I need to wear the helmet because I'm just driving kilometers from the town where I live. But once I enter the guerrilla control area, now I shouldn't wear it. So who's going to guarantee that I'm going to be safe? Who's going to guarantee that I won't have an accident? A couple of months ago, I had an accident, so I know I need to wear it. But if I wear it and the guerrilla notice it, then I will be punished." So you can see how such a simple decision, such as wearing or not wearing a helmet, why am I so confused? A helmet
Yeah.
becomes such a big concern. And you can also see how students here start playing a different role, right? This is not just teachers taking care of the students, but the students who live in the guerrilla control area taking care of the teacher. So you can see how the roles that they play change, and in the case of the students, expand. So that's, I mean, I have more examples than that. When you see how just a helmet, wearing heels, dyeing your hair becomes a huge thing because of the role that guerrillas are playing. And this is an area of protracted armed conflict where people more or less have a sense or are able to measure the temperature of war. I cannot imagine how it is when war just erupts and you're in the middle of everything.
Yeah. I feel like, wow. I mean, to me, it's just so fascinating that, like, I really like the kind of example that you gave, where from the outside, you can think of these places as something that's worn, torn, and entire livelihoods are just like shut down. But your simple example of like somebody still putting on a backpack, going to school, still trying to make sense of the world, especially as a child. Like there have been a few films that I've seen, but I cannot remember, where it just kind of describes how, from the lens of a child, they're still just trying to figure it out. They may not even really fully understand what's happening. They're just like, would you disagree with that?
Yes. Yes.
They are fully aware.
They know. They have so much information. They're so skillful in reading their territory. Who's whom? What are they doing? I have data of students just letting teachers know that the army is coming, or that the guerrilla and the specific front are getting closer. So I think that what drastically changed through this research to me was to realize that there's nothing as special about their lives. There's a lot that it's unique, but their desires, their aspirations are not very different from the ones that we have. They want to run their daily lives in the same way that we want to run them. So I do think that we need to keep working to recognize the physical and emotional harm inflicted by war. At the same time, we have the capacity to imagine their lives with full dignity and in their full complexity. What do you think?
Would you say? I don't even know what I mean. It's so I'm feeling, even as we talk about this, I'm feeling very privileged. I feel like doesn't do enough of justice of the experience, but it feels there's obviously feelings of just unfairness. I mean, it is sometimes so overwhelming. I mean, the last few conversations we've been having on the show have been a lot more. It's at a different level when you're talking about like, okay, does we were the last conversation was just talking about how the market has started to play such a big role on American education specifically, and what are the impacts of that? How did that change? But I think some of the things that you're sharing are just so far from a lot of the conversations I've had. I think I've only had one other conversation on the show about conflict specifically, but I think growing up also, the way I read history was so much like, oh, war is something that happens in the past. War is something that happens. It never felt something that happens so close to home, you know? And I think like that is,
I mean, that's a privilege of empire, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, I mean, if you grew in the US, war was an international event.
Yeah.
Was something that you will watch on TV.
Yeah. And so, I mean, for you, I feel like what has your experience been like teaching in the US? And do you feel like there must be a lot of students who are obviously deeply inspired by personal experiences to come study, who may come from international countries or what, but for the students who are primarily United States born, what are some of the perspectives you feel like are just hard to maybe grasp or get your mind around when you grow up kind of distant from war?
I mean, first of all, I want to say that I love my students. I never thought that I was gonna love my Wisconsin students in the way that I do, and I wanna give you a little bit of history here. I graduated in 2016, and I had a Fulbright, so I had to go back to Colombia. I was working as a university professor in Bogota for 2 years, and then I learned about this position. I applied and I got it, and as always, issues with the visa, lots of delays. And my colleagues in Colombia were constantly asking me, like, why? Why are you moving to Wisconsin? How? I mean, first of all, in Colombia, Wisconsin means nothing, right? That's the middle of nowhere. The only reference that people will have will be that 70s show. So because they were asking me, how are you going to connect with them? You connect with your students here so well. How are you going to do that labor? And when I arrived, I mean, I was shocked to see that my students didn't know where Colombia was. So I had to ask the department to buy me puzzles of Latin America. And I think that I'm kind of famous here for walking around with the puzzles. You can see them on the back of my office, those two boxes next to the Legos. Those are the Latin American puzzles, because that's one of the very first things that I need to do. I mean, I can't believe that students graduate from high school not knowing where countries across their hemisphere are located. I'm not talking about countries in sub-Saharan Africa or Asia, which are far away. I'm just talking about the Americas. So that's the first thing. But I think that when I get to the classroom, there's a lot of curiosity about where I come from and what I do, and I try to be very open about my identity. I have a class that is called Education Across the Americas, Empire, Capitalism, and Resistance. And I love that class because I think that I bring everything that I am into the classroom. I feel very comfortable using words in English and in Spanish. That's something that I don't tend to do as much in education emergencies, for example. So I see students who are open, who are curious, who are ready to do the work. It's true that there's lots of things that they don't know when they get to the classroom, but once they're there, they're ready to learn, to absorb, and I appreciate that. And my graduate students, I think they're exceptional. They're just fantastic, and we have plenty of opportunities to have rich and deep conversations about what it means to be teaching in this particular setting at this particular point in history. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. No, I mean, so what, because you briefly mentioned it where when you were teaching in Colombia, am I saying it right?
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
not,
yeah. We go.
Colombia. I feel like people were sharing that, like, how will you connect with the students there? What have you found to be easier points for both sides to kind of see each other, understand the other person's perspective? Because also growing up in Colombia, it must also be hard to understand what it's like to grow up in Wisconsin, right? Because that's such a
Not only
different
that, but
experience
I'm
too.
getting older, right? There's a huge generational gap. The other day I asked my students, hey, do you want me to play music? And they were like, yeah. And I play my Spotify list that is called Happiness. And I heard some of them saying, it sounds like a disco from the 2000s. So what I want to highlight here is that I'm aware that there's a gap, not only because I was born and raised in a different country, but also because we're just different generations. And what I do about it is I ask lots of questions about their school experience, their curriculum, what they learned, what they didn't. And I think that together we do a lot of unlearning. I mean, it's not just about their stereotypes and their biases, but also the stereotypes that I have about what it means to be raised and born in the US and being a Gen Z, right? So I think that it takes us back to the beginning of our conversation about how a classroom should be a space for free exploration and learning. I think that we're too obsessed with learning and we should be paying more attention to everything that we need to unlearn. And what are the better tools that we can devise to do that work together?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like a lot of what you're sharing, I feel it very deeply for me as well, because I think so much of what my life has been in my 20s has been unlearning all the things that I thought I knew about myself or the world. And I think it's interesting because oftentimes when you rely on stereotypes, or it's because you don't actually know, you don't have any like face-to-face interactions with the people that you need to create judgments of. So what you end up turning to is what you see on the news or what you heard from your uncle, or it's something or something else, because it's not built out of personal experience. And so I spent the last many years like actively putting myself in environments that I knew nothing about but I've heard so much about, and every time my entire worldview changes, because I'm like, what I thought I knew has nothing to do with what is actually the case. I feel like, and I want to do that with so many more things. I mean, even on this in this conversation, and it's obviously a very privileged take to strive to see or learn things that, because you always have the option to leave. And that's something I've also just observed in my own journey, where it's like I'll put myself in environments, but in the back of my mind, I know I can leave. Where the true experience of a lot of these environments is you don't have that option. It's not like easy, like, all right, time for me to leave. This is a little too much. And until that kind of box closes in, you'll never truly have the experience of what it's like to maybe be in these experiences outside of trying your best to kind of empathize. So in that sense, how do you feel like are some ways that help people get as close to understanding the experience of others while still always having that slight space or separation?
I mean, that's exactly why I wanted to do ethnographic work. I knew, I mean, the day I started my doctorate, that I wanted to go to a place that will just change me. I wanted to change through field work. I mean, living in Colombia in the 80s and 90s, all I will hear on TV and my family were comments against the guerrillas and against insurgency and all that violence. And the reason why Colombia was so underdeveloped was because of guerrillas. I mean, 20 years just listening to that. I mean, a little bit less, right? I have a BA in history, and I think that university played a huge role in shaping my research questions. But I hear you. I mean, it doesn't matter how long I lived in Ecuador or later on how many times I went to Arauca. I have the privilege of living, and I don't think that we can completely, it wouldn't be fair to claim that we know what it means, because we will never know. But then, in answering your question about how can we do that, I think that storytelling helps a lot. I mean, good stories. We all want to hear good stories. It doesn't, I mean, from this conversation, I really hope that you won't forget how important one simple artifact could be, right? The heel, the hem, the casco, the Hamlet, the Hamlet,
The helmet.
the helmet, the helmet, right? It's just like, okay, now you will remember that for one teacher, the decision to wear it or not was huge because she was in a protracted armed conflict. I think that's, I mean, those will be my two insights, just conversation and connection with people. Listen with all our senses, if that's possible.
So I guess here's another. I'm just curious. I'm just spitballing things. I just want to hear your
curious
opinion.
Too. Let's keep going.
I just want to hear your opinion, because I mean, I don't. Again, like, I feel like I'm not. I'm slowly learning to become more aware and learn things, but I'm still at a point where not everything I will say will, be, I guess, correct. But I'm learning. So I guess what I'm curious to understand is, I think one of the things with growing up in the U.S. and is you get a certain level of, I don't know where it comes from. I'm really curious to understand how it gets formulated, but you get this unique experience of feeling like, which is why you don't know what countries exist below you, which is why you may not even know what state you are on if you were to locate yourself on a map, where you start to feel like the whole world revolves around this place. And it comes out in really small things. I hear it all the time. People will be like, oh, this one artist, it's the biggest artist in the whole world. But without really knowing how big the world is and how many other people there are. And the world doesn't revolve around American culture or American cinema. There's just a lot more going on in other places. And I think what I'm curious to ask you is, there comes, I guess, a certain level of like peace from that privilege when you're like, oh, the whole world revolves around this one little LA, the whole world, this is the center of the epicenter of the world, or San Francisco. And you don't have to really sit with the kind of pain that exists everywhere. And a part of, like, if your journey is, I want to be, I don't know, let's say a better person or something like that, then I guess the part of your process is to be like, how do I open myself to what is happening? How do I open myself to the pain that perhaps this form of consumption is causing, or whatever, to get tapped into the consequences of certain actions. But I feel like there are so many people who just seeing that or confronting that is actually just so overwhelming that, like, it motivates them to actually sink into that feeling of like, this is the center a bit more, just to feel peaceful. How do you, I guess, break somebody out of that kind of closed world without like having their entire world just crumble and them being very overwhelmed by what the world really is like? Because I think that's a very delicate process.
It is. And I have seen the effects of crashing worlds in the students. So your intuition is completely right. What I strive to do as a teacher is to bring humor. I think that, humor, care, good stories, and arguments coming from different viewpoints. It's so difficult because as a teacher, you see your students in the classroom, you can read their faces and their bodies, but you know nothing about what's going on in their brains. So trying to think with them and learn about their process. I mean, right now I'm using the blue notebooks that I know students in this country hate so much, but I found them so helpful. A student's journal in class, and that helps me get a sense of how they're navigating the content that we're discussing. I don't have one simple answer. I think that it all depends on the student, the relationship that I have with them, and the content that they find so difficult to digest. But it's labor of love, and it needs a lot of consistency. I don't think that it will be fair for me as a teacher to come the first day of class and just crush the world. I think that is just a conversation that we build throughout the semester. And sometimes it continues, right? With graduate students, it's very easy to keep a long-term conversation in contrast to undergrads. Undergrads come to your classroom, and the last day of classes, they're like, okay, I will never see you again. I need to get ready for the next 5,000 things that they need to do. So yeah, I hear you. I think you're right. And that's a risk that we need to be aware of.
Yeah, I find this to be really interesting, especially in spaces or classes where the information is far more personal and can move you drastically. Like, for example, I took an existentialism class in college, and it was the first time the serious question of like, why shouldn't you kill yourself was asked, right? And to really, everyone had to really sit with that. There was no like, and to really ask that question and talk about it and not just be like, no, life is great, you should totally, like really like hear what different thinkers have thought, work through. But that teacher was not trained to handle emotions. That teacher wasn't trained to like actually hold space to have these really tough conversations, where some students now had this new thought that they had to sit with that is not so simple, you know? And so I think these types of conversations are hard because it's not just about pushing forward some curriculum, making sure that the content material gets across. It's also a deep emotional, spiritual, whatever you want to call it, work that happens where your relation to everything changes. And sometimes
The world and your family too.
yeah. And sometimes do you think that the presenter of that information should also take on the responsibility of holding the emotional space, or are there ways systematically where we can kind of have like these types of courses come with these spaces where maybe someone who's trained in doing that can do the emotional side of it, and then someone who's trained in passing the because it's hard to do both. Not everyone can do both.
I think that I apply the same principle in classroom and when I'm doing research. If I cannot hold the space, I will not ask the question, and in the classroom, I will not tackle that. I mean, I think that my role as a teacher is to take care of my students, and if I cannot that, I can't do that fully. I don't want to open doors that then I won't be able to close. So I try to be careful with that. And again, I think that scaffolding conversations, and always, is not just about the content. I think that we need to build the skills so students can work through ideas with more tools, right? So in my classroom, I'm super invested in discussion. I think that it is very difficult for us in this society to have conversations about difficult topics. And here at UW-Madison, we have a project that I love. It's called the Discussion Project. And they teach us how to bring the discussions to the classroom. And discussion is a skill that you need to develop. You cannot get to the first day of classes and expect the students to share their drastically different points of view on abortion. Like, you don't do that. You need to go step by step, build a community, build a space, provide tools, so students can feel the freedom, but also be aware of how far they can go within that space.
Yeah. And I have a lot of questions for you because I feel like one of the complicated things is, and this is where I think a lot of the tensions can rise. It's one thing, I think philosophy sometimes can do this, which I find to maybe be problematic, but maybe not, is that it abstracts away from the ground reality. So when you talk about something like, what are the ethics of abortion? It seems like you're existing in this cloud as you like discuss it without having to really sit with like, what are the lived consequences of these conversations that we're having, right? Where I think politics exists on the other extreme where you're so on the ground, you sometimes don't get that same space to maybe like abstract a little bit so it doesn't feel so rooted in like what is happening today, and you can kind of get at these like larger, more abstract, generalized themes. And I think I've experienced both sides of those, and I see the consequences. One of the things that I'm curious about here is, let's say somebody was to disagree with maybe what's being taught in class, or someone has a different view on how things should be done, or they have a different view on war and whatever. In the classroom, I think, how do you, without being like, no, you're wrong, like creating space for discourse to exist, but in spaces like this, that discourse will trigger some students. It will have real consequences for their lives. How do you kind of navigate allowing that discourse, but knowing when to reel it in, maybe, you know?
I think that's one of the biggest challenges that I'm facing right now. First of all, I think there's a self-selection of students when they're choosing the classes. I mean, by reading the theme, you get a sense of the content. Here, EPS students across campus tend to think about our department in a particular way. So I think that we tend to attract a very specific group of students. That's one thing. I don't think it's enough just to say, okay, share your ideas with me, and remember, you can say everything you want to say because this is a safe space. That can be just empty words. What I try to do in class is to bring materials that represent different points of view and evidence, so students can build their arguments. But I will say it's very difficult to hide my politics. So going back to war. In education emergencies, we analyze the different causes of forced migration, one of them, of course, being war. And for that class, I take them to the Veterans Museum here in Madison. And I have I think it's a very limited, constrained script, the one that they have. They're honoring veterans and glorifying war. And when we analyze the museum script, I ask them, what do you think? And then they want to know what I think, and I say it. So I will be naive in claiming that students have the same space I have in sharing ideas. And I'm aware of that. It's hard. Again, because you don't know what the students are thinking. I had one student that I know he struggled a lot with the class, and he came to my office hours 3 times, which for undergrads, I think it's a lot. And those 3 times he came to my office hours, he shared materials with me, we read things together, we talked about movies on war, because he wanted to show me a different perspective, and I follow him and I engage with him. If I have done that with every single student, no. With him, because he was particularly troubled by the content that I shared in the syllabus. So a very imperfect, talking about perfection, a very imperfect but honest answer, to your question.
Yeah. No, I mean, thank you for sharing. And I think like that is the mega complexity of this whole thing, where it's like, in my personal experience as well, at UCSD, so the first 3 years in the college that I was at, we took this dimensions of culture class. And so that was a kind of, they provided a different interpretation of history, and it was centered a lot more around marginalized voices. And one of the main kind of core messages was like racism is embedded in the structures of this society. But the way that the material was taught was very one-sided. So there was no real space for discourse because the content that was provided was very much like, this is the case 100%. And so what I found to be a cause of that is, for me, is I very much fully understood the argument. I personally was like, yes, this is 100% true. But when I went out into the world, like whether I went back to where I grew up or whatever, I did not have the tools to actually hold these difficult conversations because I've only read one side of the argument. So anytime somebody presented a different side, you're a bad person, you don't know anything, blah, blah, blah. You're not aware enough. That's all I knew how to respond to that because I was never presented with an opposing argument because anyone who holds that is just ignorant and dumb. But that just is not the case. And then I took a philosophy of race, class, a philosophy of gender and sex, and those, to me, presented the entire spectrum of ideas on the particular topic, which prepared me so much more to actually go into the world and understand why people think the way they do. But the opposite side of that is I also have the privilege of not being impacted by that particular conversation to the degree where to the extent where I can just like philosophize about it for a long time. Like, what does race mean? Like, and that allows me. But if it was directly affecting my day to day, would I still be able to like abstract and philosophize about race? I don't know,
But I love what you're saying because it shows that you cannot expect one class to do all the work. And that's one of my fears with the students. They're so busy doing 2 majors, 2 certificates, having 4 jobs, that they don't have the time to put the pieces of the puzzle together. I think it's a real privilege when I meet the students who are just covering all their, liberal arts credits for a semester. So their mindset is one, and they kind of spend time bringing things together. But when you have students who are taking education emergencies, chemistry 3, calculus 2, and gender studies 1, like, how do I make sense of the world through this content?
That's interesting.
And
that is interesting.
We should have a space to help the students build the bridges.
Yeah. Imagine one year you took all
reconcile what you learned with the philosopher and what you learned in this other anthropology of culture, whatever class you took.
Yeah. No, that is so interesting. Like, what if rather than having this kind of all over the place, each quarter had like you take all your maybe humanities courses, you take all your, like that would be interesting.
I don't think that we're paying enough attention to our attention. Our attention is limited. And right now, because it's so commodified and we're so obsessed with being hooked to a screen, it's really hard to spend time just building connections and like sitting with thoughts and ideas. Going back to the differences between my students' experiences and my experience in Colombia, when I did my BA in history, I only took classes that were related to history. And I think 2 or 3 related to anthropology, 1 or 2 to philosophy, and history, like content, then theories, and then methods. But my mindset was deeply soaking into this content. Of course, I'm very ignorant about lots of different topics, right? So I don't want to say that this is a good model. But I do see what that experience allowed me to do in terms of my historical understanding of the world.
I guess, what are your thoughts on this? So, do you think this would be effective if, like, let's say you took a singular course, right? And for every material you teach, let's say there was like the opposite, hypothetically, let's just say there is an opposite of these ideas. Would it be useful, you think, for students to experience one class and then the opposite class, and to be forced to kind of contend with 2 opposing thoughts? I think that's the only way you can go into the world and really But then here's the problem. But the problem is then you give the risk for, which I don't know, in theory should be the point, but you give space for people to take ideas that could actually be harmful or dangerous.
I don't think that it's about taking the opposite, right? I mean, it will be very problematic from my perspective to teach particular content at a higher ed institution. There are some things that I don't think we should devote our time. That's my personal take. But I do think that we could craft experiences for our students where the different courses they take complement each other and help them analyze one key issue from multiple perspectives. And if there are contradictions, that's great. But I think it will be limiting to think in terms of opposites.
Yeah. And I guess the fear then is like, I don't know, let's say you take a class where you hear different perspectives of race, for example. But that means you also expose yourself to what white supremacists may think. And then what if while you're in a class, that particular thought actually like compels you more? And then all of a sudden you're like, this actually is true. And I think that is there has to be some trust that if all sides of the argument are provided, you will still lean by choice in one direction. But if you don't have full faith in that, then presenting all arguments can be scary. But I think that I don't know. How do you can approach that?
I'm thinking about the classes that I teach. I mean, teaching a class against migration, the whole right-wing curriculum on why migration is hurting this country.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on how far we want to take the principle of academic freedom.
Yeah.
And
I do think that in the long run prepares you more for the world than when you don't have to actually contend with them in your intellectual training, you know?
I mean, it will force us, a model such as that one, it will force us to, I don't know, maybe revamp our syllabus and build much more compelling arguments.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I love what you're doing, and I appreciate you're pushing me to think about this, because I'm so convinced that academic freedom should be a principle in all higher ed institutions, but I'm also aware of the implications it could have. So let's keep doing this.
Yeah. Yeah, no, but I mean, it is just, I think I've personally been so fascinated by this because this is what scares me. And I've experienced this personally. True education comes as a natural consequence, the true freedom of thought. But growing up, I grew up in a very conservative Indian household, which was embedded in my particular sect of being Indian was also very, very conservative. And so as I've gotten older, it's become so clear to me that the goal was never true education, because that actually allows you to think. And when you start thinking, you might think differently than what they want you to think, you know? And so it became clear to me that the true goal from their perspective is learn the skills that you need to so you can go get an employment, but don't learn enough so that you think differently from us, right? So and I sometimes
was
wonder...
it explicit? Did you get that message explicitly from your parents?
Yeah, I mean, I think as of late, after it's happened, yes. But early on, it was more like education's great. But as people have to contend with the consequences of what a free mind looks like, that's a lot more scary, you know? Where like, then, you know, I mean, I made a whole bunch of decisions. I run a podcast for my life now, you know, I'm not doing there's so many decisions I've taken since then that's like opened me up to different possibilities and worlds and open-mindedness that often doesn't align with the kind of conservative views that I think they once, you know, my family once had for me. And I guess the reason I bring that up is I feel like that is the complexity of education, where like the highest form of it really does allow you to think, which means that the people educating no longer have control of where that thinking goes. And
That's why we
that,
love it, right?
yeah, in theory, that's why you should love it. And I just wonder, yeah, and I think that's why, I don't know, it's just so interesting because like mathematical freedom looks very different than like political free, like thinking about politics freely. It looks very different than like, oh, I'm able to like completely come up with a new form of algebra that now completely breaks up. That has less impact on a person's day to like, you know, I can't use that to use to gain power and put control over you. Where in the same way, I feel like if you're able to like warp the sword of philosophy or political science, you're able to really, you can use that for nefarious reasons. And so academic freedom across different disciplines also, I think, materialize very differently.
For sure.
But it's
I like the
fascinating.
idea of, yeah, I do think that we need to open other spaces. And I'm aware of the political implications of it. I'm gonna keep thinking about this.
Yeah, I would love to know what you think more too, because I've always been, I think this is something that really needs to be talked about and can in many ways be attributed to why discourse in this country can often just seem like if you don't agree with me, you're a bad person on all sides, you know. And I think truly sitting with at least giving some level of I wouldn't say respect, but at least not having to turn to being like they're stupid, that's why they believe this, and being like, you know, even I think for me, bringing back to my family, that's something I always had to do my whole life, where I still have a lot of love for my family, but they hold a lot of beliefs that I personally very strongly disagree with. But having to always make space for those two things. Okay, I'm not going to think you're stupid, which is why you think what you think, but I'm going to try to put myself in your shoes and understand why you think about the world that you do. And when I really put myself in that context, sometimes I understand why. But from where I see the thing, I completely understand why I don't agree with what you think or how you view the world. And so I've always had to split my mind into these two, where I've like had to understand why someone can view otherwise while holding space for I don't agree.
But that's something that we should be doing more often,
Yeah.
right? I mean, both things at the same time. I keep thinking about how the university would look like if we had this super open model where you have classes that are looking to the same topics from radically different points of view. And of course, we're not necessarily doing that, but students have access to some programs where they explore something similar. So here at UW, we have the deliberation dinners, where throughout a year, students get together, have a meal together, they come prepared with particular readings, and then they discuss difficult topics. And what's beautiful about the project is that in each of the tables, you will have students representing all the political continuum. So you will have super progressive students with conservative, libertarian, socialist students coming together once a month to share a meal and talk about something that is important in this country right now. So, well, this to say that, yeah, we might not be teaching the classes, but we can be creative in opening spaces to put into practice those skills and learn those arguments and ideas too.
Yeah. What would you say, after teaching here for quite some time, are some of the lessons that you've learned, and would maybe, I don't know, either what did you learn teaching in Colombia that you bring here, and what have you learned here that you would maybe bring back there?
Prepare a lot for your class. Do your homework. I mean, read as much as you can, read widely, spend time crafting the materials that you're going to use in class, and thinking about the students, how you're going to walk with them through the lesson. That's the first thing that I learned, I guess, in Colombia. Then build strong connections with your students. I think that we need to know their names. I always ask them, how you doing? How was the quiz? You had an exam? What happened with the car? Like those very basic questions that just show them that I do care. I'm not performing care. I'm just letting you know that I know who you are. And if you need me, you can just come to my office anytime.
Oh.
And that doesn't mean that I will be able to solve all your problems, but that means that you have an ally, a partner that will help you navigate the campus and find resources if I don't have them directly. And I think that we need to bring a lot of curiosity to the classroom. I mean, getting to the classroom thinking that you know it all is just going to make it so lame and boring. I love learning with the students. That's the reason why I love being a teacher. Yeah.
I feel like, I mean, Paulo Freire talks a lot about that, like blurring the line between the teacher-student and the student-teacher. And I think I try to bring that in, but I think it's just so important, especially in academia, because there's such a hierarchy.
It's so hard to do. It's so hard to do. When I start the semester, I always give students a chance to ask me anything they want to know about me, because I want them to see me as a person, not as a professor. And they are so shy in asking personal questions.
Because it's a practice, and many people have never done it to another professor.
Don't you want to gossip a little bit? Don't you want to know anything about your professor with accent? Anything? So it's an effort. It's something that you need to do with them every time you meet them.
Yeah. And, I want to close this conversation off just talking a little bit about hope. We started talking earlier just about it, but I feel like hope is often the powerful force that drives so much of a lot of the beautiful work that gets done around the world in education and conflict resolution. So just the belief that things are possible. This is a whole other conversation to be had. I would love to one day maybe have that with you again on the show, but just about what our dreams of a utopia maybe be, what yours are, can you envision a world where no war or conflict exists?
Okay, so I have many answers to that question. The first one is, I don't think in hope as a catalyst in the same way that I think of anger. I think that we underestimate the power that anger has to produce change. And I think that we should recognize that we're angry. We're upset about what's going on, and we need to name it, and we need to sit with it. I mean, all this bubbly happiness, like all the enthusiasm that you see in the US, I think it's stopping us from producing change. So yes to hope, but also yes to anger, and use it to mobilize action. In terms of the world that I would like to see, I want to see a world where power is not centralized in any person, institution, or nation. I would like to see much more autonomy and a space for communities to make decisions about what the good life means to them. I worry about the inclination that we have to dictate what the good life should be for others. And a world where we're ready to create and think freely about the problems that we're facing. It's very hard for me. I mean, from everything that I have done in my research and in my teaching, it will be very hard for me to think that war is going to stop. War is here to stay, and it's only going to get worse. I mean, with climate change, that's very obvious to me. So within that context, how are we going to respond? Yeah.
Damn, and understanding.
It's not a happy answer.
It's not about a happy answer. But I think also just understanding the desire for power, like how intrinsic that seems to be in human nature to some extent, and there will always be some people who push that boundary of how much power they yearn for, and how to actually build, like, not to dream of a world where that just doesn't exist, because I think those individuals will always arise, but how do you build entire systems that kind of maybe give less availability for one individual like that to truly garner that much power? I don't know. I one thing I do wish is, even though I was in policy school for 2 years, so much of this work is also imagination and dreaming, because it's very easy to be like, okay, this is the one small change I want.
That's why I'm telling you, Ruha Benjamin's book.
Yeah. Okay.
Imagination, a Manifesto.
Yeah. I mean, I just think it's so important, because it's, for us to truly envision something new, you have to, I think that's why science fiction is amazing. I think you have to blow your mind up to be like, rather than being constrained with what is, what if I could reconstruct the whole thing, what could it be like? And then, that's how I think the only way to kind of really radically think of something different, rather than just always these tiny changes. And it's not that you have to build it, but even that practice and discussing what is your crazy envision of a future society like with mine, and can we, keep improving our ideas, and maybe one day we can kind of just daydream and yeah, we can just daydream together and just think about what society in a magical world could maybe be like, and just to see what that plays out to be.
And for that, we need to push each other, right? It cannot be a solo task.
Yeah.
Because sometimes when we think about imagination is an individualized understanding of imagination, but it should be collective. So how do we create spaces where we can get together and dream of a different world and then strategize? Like, step. How do we make it happen?
And you need everyone together. You need artists, you need engineers, you need policy people, you need technologists, you need everyone. It cannot be done just through one lens or one perspective. And I think it's exciting work too. It's
urgent work.
Yeah.
It needs to happen now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, I really want to thank you so much for coming on the show today. I love speaking with you. I feel like it was amazing.
No, it was fun. It was unexpected. So big thank you for all the difficult questions. I'm going to keep thinking about the implications of academic freedom within the current political climate, not only in this country, but in the world. And I appreciated all the questions that you asked. So hopefully we'll be able to think together again.
Yeah. And at the end, after all of this, was it the kind of random adventure that we talked about in the beginning? Yeah, it was very unexpected. You know what? I spent a lot of time drafting my answers to the questions that you shared. I even panicked because you asked a question about human rights ed, and the last time that I thought about human rights in relation to human rights ed was back in 2021. So I went back to the paper like, why did I say that? No, it was a rich conversation. We need more of this. And I want to say thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. It's been so lovely recording season 12, and I hope you're having a great week. And as per usual, stay re-educated.